In the previous video, we talked about how to make the impossible easy. If you haven't watched that video yet, you can find the link below. One of the most powerful ways to understand how to make the impossible easy is to identify times in your life when you've already done this. Every example you come up with from your own life will give you that much more confidence in your instinctive power to keep achieving the impossible. For instance, if you look back to the day you graduated from high school, what did you accomplish during the previous 4 years that you would have thought to be impossible when you first walked in the door as a freshman? Give yourself a moment to think about what changed for you during your 4 years of high school and what you did during those 4 years that you probably thought was impossible when you were a freshman. When I first asked myself this question, I could think of several things because high school is really all about gaining capabilities. But the thing that really blew me away was when I joined the wrestling team. You wouldn't think that going out for a sport in high school would be a big deal, but it was for me. I grew up fat. I was so fat that people would drive by me when I was walking home from school and call me names. I could never understand why anybody would want to scream insults at a complete stranger. But they did. I suppose that's one reason I don't. Anyway, when I began my freshman year in high school, I decided that what I was going to do was lose weight. I'd already tried and failed half a dozen times, and like with most diets, whatever weight I managed to lose eventually came back, and then some. But the year before I entered high school, one of my older brothers, Stuart, joined the wrestling team. He lost a bunch of weight, and he kept it off, and he looked like a Greek god. So I figured maybe I could do the same thing. Yeah, he was bigger, stronger, and a whole lot more aggressive than I was. But how hard could it be? It's just wrestling, right? How about impossible? Psychologically, physiologically, emotionally, I was about as far from a wrestler as you could get. I didn't have an aggressive bone in my body unless you tried to steal one of my French fries. I hated exercise, and I hated being lectured about my daily intake of nutritious foods like ice cream and chocolate chip cookies. In fact, my favorite hobby at that age was to eat junk food and read comic books. Did I mention I was overweight? Anyway, despite the sheer improbability of me becoming an athlete, I was so sick and tired of being fat that I made a commitment to myself to make the wrestling team, even though, in my heart of hearts, I knew that it was just simply impossible. So when I showed up for the first week of practice, before I knew it, I was being tossed around by bigger, stronger, and much better wrestlers, including my brother Stu. It was not my finest hour. I realized then and there that it would be impossible for me to continue. But I kept going anyway, because I was committed to the outcome, even though I knew it was impossible. And a funny thing happened along the way. I began to add capabilities. First, I started lifting weights and adding muscle. Before this point in my life, the only muscle I had was in my stomach. The next thing we did was starve ourselves. I can remember feeling so hungry that I bought a tiny vial of breath freshener and squirted it in my mouth from time to time to give myself the illusion that I had actually had something to eat. Even worse than starving was the thirst. When it came time to make weight each week, I wouldn't even drink water for at least a day before weighing because every ounce mattered. And as we starved and dehydrated, we worked out like madmen. You expend a lot of energy in wrestling anyway because you're so often carrying around not just your weight, but your opponent's weight. To make this more fun, we practiced in a gym that felt like a steam bath, where the steam smells like month-old sweat. Just to make sure that we could make the most of this incredible exertion, we wore sweat clothes covered by plastic sweatsuits, essentially trying to squeeze every last ounce of fat and moisture from our bodies. I remember after practice, I would wring sweat from my t-shirt like water from a washcloth. Imagine working out in a steam bath while you're covered with saran wrap. That's what it felt like. The bottom line was that wrestling was far too tough a sport for a wimp like I was. But somehow I hung in there. And within a few weeks, I had dropped so much weight that I was almost unrecognizable, even to myself. And then my whole world began to change. For one thing, nobody picked on me anymore. Bullies loved to prey on mild-mannered fat kids, but apparently not so much on wrestlers. More importantly, I began to think of myself differently. I looked at the new and thinner me in the mirror and decided to lose my pocket protector. Yeah, I actually wore one. And my wingtip shoes. Yeah, I wore those too. And it was time, finally, to ditch the Brill cream. Let's not go there. And trade my eyeglasses for contact lenses. By the end of my first wrestling season, I'd gone through what amounted to a complete makeover, both physically and psychologically and emotionally. I had committed to a goal that was utterly impossible for me, and somehow I managed to achieve it. And like impossible goals do, it transformed my entire life. Before I knew it, I was lettering not just in wrestling, but in other demanding sports like crew and cross country, where before no one on the playground would choose me for a game of pickup baseball or football or basketball, suddenly guys wanted me on their team. I was even doing better in school. Don't ask me why. But the biggest change of all, psychologically and emotionally, was that the girls in my high school suddenly realized I was alive. For a 14-year-old boy, that was nirvana. So that's one of my stories. What about you? Here's a great question to ask yourself to come up with some ideas. What have you achieved in your life that you would have thought was impossible when you were 18? You might want to start with your income. How much more do you earn today than you did when you graduated from high school? 10 times? 100 times? 1,000 times? And on the day you graduated, if you tried to glimpse your future, would you have believed it was possible for you to be earning what you're earning today? Our lives are full of examples of how we've made the impossible easy. We've all done it. We're all born with the impossibility instinct. But most of us don't realize that we have this instinct. At one time or another, we've all made the impossible easy in our lives, which is amazing, but we took the process for granted. Most of us didn't even realize that there was a process. So it never occurred to us that the same way we made one impossible thing easy might work for something else. Successful entrepreneurs are like the poster children for this. They live lives full of achievement. Yet even the most successful entrepreneurs eventually reach a point where they yearn to take their lives to a whole new level beyond anything they've ever done before. They don't want to grow their business by 30%. They want to grow it by 1,000%. They want to expand their impact on the world by a factor of 10 or even more. They're ready to reach for the stars, for the impossible. They don't know how, because they don't realize they already know how. The secret is commitment to the impossible. If you want to achieve the impossible, you have to commit to it, even though you believe it's impossible. This really does sound crazy, right? But remember, this is an instinct. This is how you are wired as a human being. For the first part of your life, it was automatic. But after your body stopped growing, in other words, after you stopped getting taller, the process was no longer automatic, but the instinct was still there. To activate it, all you have to do is commit to the impossible, even though you know it's impossible. And sure enough, when you commit to a goal that you think is impossible, something remarkable happens. Your brain instinctively begins to make it possible. Here's why. When you think something is impossible, it's like you flip a switch in your brain that says, don't even bother to try. Why waste your time, right? Stick with what you already know you can do. But when you flip that switch to commitment, even though you're still convinced it's impossible, your brain says, in effect, okay, you're serious. This thing is no longer a waste of time. I guess I better figure out how to make it happen. This simple switch makes all the difference. This simple switch is what makes the impossible possible and then easy. Your commitment is what flips the switch. But you really have to believe that what you're committing to is impossible for you. If you think it's possible, if you think that just maybe I could pull this off, you aren't being ambitious enough. You need to raise the bar until you think it's impossible. As leadership coach David Kitchen says, If you think it's possible, try adding a 0 to it. When you commit to what you genuinely believe is impossible for you, you'll be amazed at what happens when your impossibility instinct takes over. And here's something that will really blow your mind. When you commit to the impossible, it's actually easier than what you're doing now. Let this sink in for a moment. Achieving the impossible is easier to do than achieving the possible. This turns conventional wisdom squarely on its head. But the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. And in our next video, we'll talk about the secret to making the impossible easy. Here's the link right up there. I'll join you there in a minute.